Being 7 o'clock, I'll call the Marathon County Board of Supervisors to order, please. Will please rise and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and please remain standing because following that will be a moment of reflection. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We will have the reading of the notice, please.
An educational meeting of the Marathon County Board of Supervisors will be held at the Marathon County Courthouse, Assembly Room 500 Forest Street in the city of Wausau at 7 p.m. on Thursday, October 17th, 2019, and the agenda was duly signed and posted.
Thank you. I would like to request everyone please silence their cell phones or put them on vibrate as to not interrupt the meeting. And we will proceed to roll call. So I would request that all supervisors sign in, please. And we will proceed. So I'd like to welcome all of the visitors that we have this evening, and also welcome to the viewing audience that we have. And we will move on to agenda item number 7, public comment. We have 2 individuals who have requested to speak. First up, and so I would respectfully request that each respect the other's time limit and have 7.5 minutes for each speaker. First, we have Russ Wilson, president from the Marathon County Historical Society. So I would invite him up here to the podium to address the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be mercifully brief. This won't take 7.5 minutes.
Thank you.
I would like to have our handout be circulated by Kelly Zagzebski and Dwayne Zamzo. I would also point out that Dr. Brett Barker is on our board of directors as well. He's on the agenda later on. So this is in regard to the county's proposal for the defunding of nonprofits. And what I want to do is just, well, first of all, let me say a number of you have heard these comments before, so I apologize to you, but again, I will be very brief. I'm basically picking up from where we last left off last year. We made a presentation to this board in December of 2018, and at that point, there was a question along the lines of, well, what would the impact be to the Historical Society if you were to lose, say, $25,000? And I really didn't have an answer at that point other than to say that we would put that on our agenda for our January meeting. And we've been wrestling with that question for quite a while in our full board and executive meetings. So we receive about $54,000 in round numbers from the county. We understand that this year, 2019, is the last of that full funding. Next year, 2020, we would be minus 13.5, again, round numbers. And 2021, we would be at about minus $27,000. And that, when we get into the second year, 2021, when we're down about $27,000. That's when we appear to be on a very perilous, probably disastrous path for our exhibits, for our events, for the talks that we give. And what I want you to see with the impact statement that you have is to understand our frustration in this regard. What you see on that sheet, that represents what is the peak through 2018 of our activities, starting from when we finished the restoration of the Yawkey House, which is one of the finest restorations in the state. Looking back, that was completed around the mid-2000s. So from the completion of that project to this point in time, our events, our activities, our exhibits have just gone up like a skyrocket to where you see them for 2018, and I'm sure 2019 will even surpass that. I want to make this crystal clear. We at the Historical Society have nothing but gratitude to Marathon County. We are one of the very best county historical societies, and there are good reasons. One of the very prominent good reasons is the long history of generous contributions by the county to our operating fund, and a big contribution to the Yawkey House as well. What we know is that at this time is that the county is considering a plan to defund us along with other nonprofits over the course of the next 4 years, 25% per year. We also know that the county does its budgeting on an annual basis. What we don't know at this time is whether there is any mitigation that might be done, or what possible opportunities to mitigate this anticipated loss of revenue that might exist. I'm here to say that we are certainly all ears, and we're open to continuing discussions along those lines. But I mean, I would say, as I stand here this moment, what does my crystal ball say? It's saying that it looks like we're on the brink of a potentially disastrous course for our exhibits, our events, our very high quality programming, and that sort of thing. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Russ. We have Craig Holmes, and his address is 5910 Tricia in Weston. Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Craig Holmes, like the chairman said, and what I'd like to address this evening is the issue of the alarm permit, which is be an action item later in tonight's agenda. As a Village of Weston resident and in a home that has an alarm system installed and serviced by Permar, I have two issues. The first is whether or not it is appropriate for me to permit my alarm system. And secondly is the fact that the permit fee is about to double. So I'll take those two individually. As a Village of Weston resident, our emergency service needs are provided by Everest Metro Police Department and the South Area Fire District. The dispatch now is through the county, and I think that was a fantastic move to centralize that in the county, because it makes perfect sense. But my emergency service needs are not provided by Marathon County. They're provided by those two agencies. Like I said, our system is owned by us, but it was installed and it is serviced by Permar. What's important in that is that when there is an alarm, and thankfully up till now there hasn't been. But if there is, PERMAR very carefully vets that alarm before emergency services is notified for dispatch. If in the case of an unauthorized entry, there's a whole procedure by which they make sure that we didn't do something silly, or we left a door open. So by the time county dispatch is requested for service, they're pretty certain that somebody's in the house that doesn't belong there, and we're not, or the house has got a fire. There are other alarm situations that don't require county dispatch or emergency services. The alarm itself is silent. There are no bells, there are no whistles, there's no flashing lights, there's no balloons that get launched. The alarm is silent, except for the horn inside the house, which sole purpose is to get someone that doesn't belong there back out of the house. If we're gone for an extended period, we notify Everest Metro Police Department of the date we're gonna leave and the date we're gonna return. And we tell Everest Metro who holds keys for our house. So if there's a need for police response, the police department can meet one of those people with a key so they can safely enter the house without having to break a door down. So that's how it works. So my question is why should that be permitted when really the county does little for us? And it's a big deal, but what they do for us is dispatch when PERMAR calls on our behalf. And that's no different than if one of our neighbors saw someone in there that didn't belong and also called 911. The second issue is the permit cost. I paid it for 4 years now. It's $25. I didn't feel real good about it because I always had the same opinion as to whether or not it was appropriate. Now it's gonna double, so will $50 break the bank when 25 didn't? Obviously not. But like everybody else in this room, we are also paying for our emergency services and the dispatch through our property taxes, our sales taxes. There's also a fee on all of our telephone bills for 911 dispatch. So this is just one more way to pay additionally, and quite frankly, I've pretty well had enough. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, sir. And we will go on then to item number 8, education presentation and reports under item 8A, standing committee chairpersons or designees. Any standing committee chairs and or designees that wish to provide an update to the board? Okay. We'll move on to item number 8B. We have the history of Indigenous people in Marathon County and Wisconsin, and we are proud to have with us Dr. Brett Baker from UWSP Wausau. Barker, excuse me. Excuse me.
I always laughingly say Brett like Favre and Barker like Bob, so there you go. It works sometimes. Okay. Thank you very much. All right, let me get everything set up here, and let's see. Do we have to do anything to get going here?
It went to sleep.
Okay, it went to sleep on us. There we go. Well, while she gets that going, let me thank you for the invitation to speak here today on the history of Native peoples of Wisconsin and of Marathon County. And I hope to tell you a little bit about this topic. And here we go. All right.
Here you go.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so, all right, now we'll get set up. Here we go. I'm grateful to be here today as a member and a proud supporter of two institutions that this county supports. Russ mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of directors of the Marathon County Historical Society. I'm also a professor at UW Stevens Point at Wausau, and I appreciate what the county does for us every day and in many ways. So, the history I want to talk about tonight is a vast one, the history of Indigenous people in Wisconsin and in Marathon County. In some ways, there's no way I can adequately cover in the time I've been given, but I want to give some basic ideas, a little overview, and then leave a little time for discussion and questions, and maybe start a little conversation about some of the issues that are raised tonight. First of all, I want to mention the vastness of this history, and I think it's one that we often forget about because that history before the arrival of Europeans goes back some 13,000 years. And so one of the ways I try to make this real to people is to think about if the entire history of people living in what we now call Marathon County were to be reduced to one 24-hour day. If we were to do that, Columbus would arrive on the shores in the Americas at 11:30 p.m. Our county would have been formed at 11:50 p.m., and people who have century farms that they are justly proud of in this county would have been founded about 11:54, 11:55 p.m. So there's a vast history of people living here in this continent in North America long before European arrival. And the other interesting thing about Wisconsin as indigenous people is it's a very complicated history. Like many of you know that maybe the history of Oklahoma is one that's very complicated, the history of Indian peoples, there were Indian peoples living there before and then others moved. But Wisconsin also has a very complicated native history. First of all, there were tribes that were here before any European arrived, but no longer have a tribal presence in the state. The Sauk and the Fox, the Santee Sioux, that is the Eastern Dakota, and the Ottawa, who were here at one time and now no longer have at least a tribal presence in the state. There are also those who were here before European arrival and maintain a tribal presence in the state. The Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, the historical Winnebago, the Ojibwa, who still are often by the federal government recognized as the Chippewa, and there are 6 bands of the Ojibwa present in our state today, many more scattered throughout the upper Midwest and up into Canada, but 6 of them have reservation presences here. And to make things even more complicated, there were those tribes that arrived in Wisconsin after the beginnings of European settlement. Those were displaced from further east and then found a home, like many of our ancestors did, in Wisconsin later, the Oneida, the Stockbridge Munsee, and the Brotherton. So let's talk about that early contact. I won't say much more about the pre-contact period, but let's talk about when Europeans arrived. Many of you may be aware of this picture, about this famous sort of painting. It's the picture of Jean Nicolet arriving at Red Banks near Green Bay in 1634. And it's the first documented case of a European arriving in what today we would call Wisconsin. A few may have been wandering around the Madeline Island area a little bit earlier, but this is the first documented case. And he came in a Chinese damask robe. He thought that he might go far enough west that he would actually run into Asia. Geography was not quite settled yet in the early 17th century, but instead he found the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee where they had been living for generations before. What followed the first European contact is a very difficult story. As many of you know, Europeans unknowingly brought diseases with them that native peoples had no immunity to because they'd been isolated for thousands of years. The fur trade disrupted sort of traditional native economies and often resulted in increased competition and warfare. Between disease and competition and the movement and displacement of people, many of those tribes that encountered Jean Nicolet in 1634 would lose 90% of their population within the first generation. And I think that sort of population loss is something that still continues to haunt native peoples in this state. For the next 200 years, there was really a minimal white presence in the place that we would today call Wisconsin or Marathon County. There was the occasional fur trader, but there was the occasional small fort here and there by the French and then by the British and eventually the Americans. But there isn't a sustained presence in the state we now call Wisconsin till after really the War of 1812. It's true that the colors on the map changed, but in fact, most of the people living in the place we call Wisconsin remained indigenous peoples through much of that time. But that began to change in the 1820s and 30s. And the history of our entire state is sort of based in many of our symbols, our legends are on what followed. Lead was found in the southwestern part of the state, and that attracted a great number of European settlers, the American settlers to the southwest part of the state. The good farmland of the southeastern part of the state began to attract people who wandered around Lake Michigan and found their way up into what would become Wisconsin. And early on, many of those fur traders went back and reported not only an abundance of fur, but in places, these great white pineries that are in many ways what defined early Marathon County. And this created an increasing pressure on Native peoples to sell their land. And the federal government became quite insistent in the 1820s and 1830s in Wisconsin at that time to ask the Native peoples to sell their land. The part of the land that we call Marathon County today, a part of it was technically, although the Menominee and the Ojibwa lived here and probably engaged in seasonal activities of gathering and hunting, the Menominee formerly ceded the area of the Wisconsin River from about what today would be Wisconsin Rapids up to just north of Wausau in 1836. Much of the rest of our county was ceded in 1837 by the Ojibwa, who lived to the north of the Menominee. So most of what's Marathon County would be in this 1837 session right here. But that does not mean that those Native people disappeared. In some cases, they were removed, and that is definitely a part of the story. If we look, eventually some of them would receive reservations that are still there. The Red Cliff, the Bad River, the Lac de Flambeau, the Coudray, to the north of us, the Menominee to the east. Others were removed. The Ho-Chunk, the Winnebago to the south, were removed, and you can see through a series of removals, were moved to Iowa and up into Minnesota, later to Crow Creek, out into the Dakota Territory, to Nebraska briefly. But one of the things that the Ho-Chunk would like you to know about the story of this part of the state is, if you notice, those solid lines leaving Wisconsin are where they're being removed from the state, but those little dotted lines are where Ho-Chunk on their own initiative simply walked home and refused to be removed. Some of them, for several occasions, found their way back. And so the Ho-Chunk are proud of the fact that while they were formally removed, they simply didn't accept it and found their way home again and again. And that explains the beginning of what later became their renewed presence in the state. But by the 1840s and 1850s, most all the land had been sold to the federal government, and white settlement could ensue. After the Civil War, that story continues and in some ways becomes, if possible, an even more tragic one. Whoops, sorry, I hit the button there. All right. In the 1880s, 1930s are in some ways the low point of this story for Native peoples, because first of all, their tribal governments were destroyed by the federal government, declared void and having no power anymore. Secondly, the land that was owned by tribes was allotted into individual segments under the Dawes Act of 1887. And thirdly, the boarding schools were put in place, which forced Native children away from their homes and into a formal system of education sponsored by and demanded by the federal government. So I want to talk about the last two just a little bit, for just a little bit. The Dawes Act, which was put in effect in 1887 and remained in effect till 1934, gave the head of each Native family 160 acres each. The lesser amounts were given to his dependents. Those who declared allotment and accepted allotment, accepted this piece of tribal land, they're going to break up the reservation and make them individual landowners, were declared civilized, and that's actually the term used in the act, declared civilized and were granted citizenship as American citizens, and then the excess land was sold. And the idea was that a checkerboard pattern would exist where Native peoples would own pieces of land interspersed with white settlers, and the result would be something like what the Oneida Reservation looks like today to our east, that checkerboard pattern where you can see native and non-native land holdings, and many of us experienced that. If you drive towards Green Bay, it says entering Oneida Indian Reservation. Last time I was there, I think there's a strip mall off to my left, right, as I pass that sign. So there's still this checkerboard pattern that exists to this day. Under the Dawes Act, as you can read on that slide, the 138 million acres that were in reservations at the beginning of the period were reduced by 90 million acres, and at the end, only 48 million acres remained in Native hands. So in some ways, allotment sought to break up the land into individual parcels in a more European style of sort of land ownership. But in some ways, the most destructive to Native cultures were the boarding schools. And here, then, there are many pictures available because, frankly, those running the boarding schools were quite proud of what occurred on the right. There are many pictures of Native peoples arriving at a boarding school and then what they looked like later. They were not allowed to speak their native language. They had hair and dress were immediately put into the white fashion, and they were educated. One thing that's often not mentioned is they received history lessons, which is something I'm very sensitive to because I teach history every day. And in their history lessons, Indian peoples did not come out looking very good. Usually they were seen as enemies of progress, and this is sort of forced into children. Many of these children had to attend these boarding schools, were unable to return to their homes in summer, and by the end of their education found that they no longer really belonged to their native communities, which was indeed exactly the idea of the boarding school. These people found themselves between two worlds, not really truly maintaining their native culture, and yet not fully fitting in with the larger white culture into which they'd been introduced and indoctrinated. And so the boarding schools in some ways stripped a lot of native identity and language away, and by the 1930s had made profound impacts on native peoples. There were boarding schools all over the United States. Wittenberg had one. Many of you might be aware there was one in Wittenberg. It was a Lutheran-run boarding school. Also, Toma had a U.S. government-run Indian school. I notice on this map that I find national map makers don't always know Wisconsin geography as well as you and I do. It seems to me that Toma's a little too far south for its own good on that map, which would be this dot. But anyway, and I think Wittenberg might be a little too far north for its own good. But you get the basic idea of where those boarding schools are. Those policies came to an end, strangely enough, as part of the New Deal. Many people know that there were many, many parts to the New Deal. Indeed, the famous alphabet soup agency. So there was almost any set of three letters that you can name was probably one of FDR's programs in the 1930s, where it's the AAA or the NRA or the WPA, CCC, the TVA, the list could go on and on. There was also an Indian New Deal. The Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA, which is not Individual Retirement Account or Irish Republican Army, but is Indian Reorganization Act. That's one of the problems with acronyms. We have too many of them, frankly. But this was the Indian Reorganization Act, which restored tribal government, ended allotment, and changed the nature of boarding schools, made more schools for Indians on their own reservation with an Indian teaching presence, and in many ways sort of made them less cruel and less destroying of native cultures than they had been under previous administrations. The next few generations had their challenges, some of which have a Wisconsin story. Many native peoples were relocated to cities. It's one of the reasons there are large native populations today in cities like Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, for instance, as native peoples were encouraged to leave the reservation and go to cities, promised a lot, but often just given a one-way bus ticket. And also the other policy of termination, the idea that some tribes that were doing better for themselves, like the Menominee, might be able to strike out on their own, be terminated as a tribe, and be able to go forth in the world without that tribal identity, although very quickly, within 20 years, that had been reversed. There's also a story, of course, in Wisconsin of Indian activism, and many of you may know about the novitiate takeover in Gresham during the 1970s as Native peoples began to argue for their rights. And so there's also a dimension in the 1960s, which is about Indian activism. As much as we tell the story of the civil rights movement or the counterculture or the anti-war movement, Indian activism in the 1960s is also part of that larger American mosaic that we should not overlook. One of the, of course, more controversial things of our time was the spearfishing controversy, when Native peoples in northern Wisconsin again asserted their treaty rights to spearfish and to collect wild rice, which was less controversial, in northern Wisconsin. And many of you know that Wisconsin for a while had sort of a bad reputation, became known as the Selma of the North, and there were protests on the docks, and there was a time of some conflict and tension within those northern lakes. One of the things that I find interesting as a historian is I've had students tell me, and I think they've often gotten this from perhaps their relatives, that they somewhat resent spearfishing rights or treaty rights generally because they say, well, this is a right that a Native person sort of discovered in the 1970s, the Tribble brothers or others discovered this treaty right, and it really didn't exist, and it's something they sort of made up in the 1970s to try to get new rights. Well, I want to share a slightly different perspective on that. Those treaty rights go back in the case of Menominee to the 1850s, to an 1854 treaty. And lest you think that this was only created, the controversy was only created in the 1970s, this is a document which a delegation of Ojibwa took to Washington, D.C. in 1864 during the Civil War and presented to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, complaining that after 10 years, their treaty rights were still not being respected, and they had the right to hunt and fish off the reservation and to collect wild rice, and they expected those rights to be respected by the federal government. No one listened. In fact, the reason this document still exists and is in the State Historical Society archives is that the translator who translated it for them from Ojibwa into English tried to give it to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he read it and then said, well, I have no reason to keep this. So he gave it back to the interpreter, who then took it back home with his, he was actually a Union soldier in the 37th Wisconsin. He took it home with him after the war and ended up in his papers and was eventually donated to the Historical Society. So the question of reserved treaty rights is a very old one. It's just that, honestly, white folks just didn't listen for a very long time about what Native peoples expected and believed that they had earned as part of the treaty situation earlier on. So, in a brief overview, what is clear is that there are elements of this story which are hard and tragic. It's been a hard 500 years for Native peoples in Wisconsin and beyond. And Native communities continue to suffer real challenges, and I don't mean to undermine those or to underplay those. Challenges over health, the rate of diabetes and heart disease and dependency on alcohol and drugs is very high on and off the reservation amongst Native peoples. They continue to struggle to provide health care and education for their people, and economic opportunity, as many of you might be aware, continues to be a real problem throughout the reservations in Wisconsin and beyond. And yet, I don't want to leave on completely a sour note, because in some ways, in the last 30 and 40 years, there have been real success stories. In the languages, many Wisconsin tribes have found a way to start to preserve their languages. They've begun to teach their children the native tongue again, so it does not die out with the older native speakers. And Menominee and other forms, Ojibwa, Ho-Chunk, are making a resurgence amongst young people who are now being taught their native tongue again. And so that's a sort of positive part of that story as they become bilingual Americans. In some ways, they've shown tremendous resiliency. There are real success stories. For instance, when I was a kid, I remember reading in Ripley's Believe It or Not that the only human thing that could be seen from space was the Great Wall of China. I've since found out that's just not true. The Great Wall of China is just not thick enough to show up from space. You can't see the Great Wall of China from space. But a human-made artifact that you can see from space is the Menominee Forest. A person on the space shuttle about 20 years ago looked out the window and called down to Houston and said, "What is that green square in Wisconsin? I don't know what that is. What is that?" And it turns out it's the Menominee Forest. And of course, the Menominee now have become sort of world leaders on sustainable forestry and continue to have success in harvesting that resource in a continuing way as their elders taught them. There are other success stories too. I'm always fascinated. This is the Oneida Turtle School over by Green Bay. This is a school shaped like a turtle, which of course is the creation myth that the Oneida have, that the world began on the back of a turtle. And so that's actually the gymnasium is the turtle's head. And this is the main area with most of the classrooms. And I've been in that building. I've been lucky enough to be invited over to see that building. And it's amazing, that entire building is filled with symbols and stories about the Oneida people that they then transmit to their children. And so in some ways, there are still examples of Native people continue to carry on their traditions while also living in the modern world. And so I guess there are other things like the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act that has given Native peoples back many of their cultural items that were once in museums and the like and been returned to them, which in some ways has healed a lot of old wounds. And so I think in some ways we're getting to a much better place in our relationship between Native peoples and the larger white culture. So what points would I leave you with tonight? Well, first of all, I would say this: American Indian history is not a history that lives only in the past. It is a continuing part of the American fabric. Perhaps we're more aware of that here in Wisconsin, where there are Native peoples and reservations. I was less aware of that as a child growing up in Ohio because there are no reservations there. But it's something that, living in Wisconsin, I've become much more aware of and sensitive to. I think it's also important as we think about this story to make it clear that non-Indians do not need to feel guilt over decisions that were made by others, the terrible actions of the past. But we all need to be aware of that past so we can understand where we meet each other today. The past is never dead. It isn't even really past, as William Faulkner once said. And so we need to be aware of that story. And so to understand where Indigenous people and white people and their histories come from. And I think most importantly, as we move forward together, it's important to realize that Indigenous people are not just historical victims of their own history. They're not just victims. They have undergone a lot of hardship and their continuing problems. But to see them simply as passive victims is to sell them short. They are historical actors in charge of their own lives, trying to make the world a better place for themselves, their families, and for their communities. And those are goals that bring us together and that we can all share. And I think in that kind of spirit, we can move forward with a knowledge of Native people and understand a way to move forward together as one people, because in the end, we are all Americans. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Baker. I would like to open it up to Barker. I'm going to change your name.
Okay.
So I'd like to open it up to the board for questions.
Comments?
Comments?
Yeah, please.
Supervisor Opal.
Yes, I see there's not a lot of reservations in the eastern part of the United States. Were they all pushed this way?
Pretty much. That's why there aren't a lot further east of us. Most of them were completely removed, and reservations. In some ways, the reason reservations exist in northern Wisconsin was at the time that was not seen as valuable land as good farmland was to the south in places like Ohio or Indiana, Illinois. Now, it changed a little bit once people realized just how vast a resource the white pinery was, right? And so that changed a little bit. But initially, Wisconsin really was the northern frontier. As we think about Indian peoples being pushed to the frontier, Wisconsin's north is very much a frontier for a very long time, as many of us know from our ancestors who lived in this part of the world. And that's why I think there's a movement north. We always think of Indian peoples moving west, but in some cases they could be pushed north out of the way of what was seen as more, because the really first dynamic is good farmland, right? And so you get a little bit further north of here, as you know, the growing season gets a little more challenging, and corn can only take so much of what we have been going on the last week out there, right? And so you have kind of a different way of life in those places. Yeah.
Supervisor Gomes.
I have two questions, sir, over here.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
What's the professor of history's true definition of indigenous? And was Davy Crockett really Indian pro?
Was an Indian, what was an Indian?
Well, promoter or looking out for their rights?
More than some, although you have to see that in the terms of a 19th century context. Compared to some other people living in the same place at the same time, he comes on looking a little more sympathetic than others do, but he definitely had certain ideas about what the possibility of Indian achievement was, right? There were certain assumptions that he shared with white Americans of his time. Indigenous people, I would just say that title was sort of put on this presentation. There's no perfect term, right? The reality is, so my students in the American Indian History course, which is what the catalog calls it, say, well, should you say American Indian or Native American or whatever? The reality is no lumping term is perfect, right? So usually with Native people, you refer to them as by their tribal affiliation. They see themselves as different people, right? They would say what I often tell students is, if we think of an older kind of model, Menominee don't think they're anything like Navajo or Cherokee or other peoples, right? They're distinct peoples. In the same way I tell students, if you look back at, say, the 17th century, if you called an Englishman a Frenchman, you're likely to get knocked down in the street, right? I mean, you could call them all European, but they saw real distinctions amongst themselves that even today probably won't get you knocked down, but certainly would get an eyebrow raised if you called an Irishman a Scotsman, right? I mean, their identity is often much more local than the continent, but we tend to do that with American Indians. And so indigenous people, just those that were living here long before Europeans arrived and before Columbus's voyages. So native peoples, I have sometimes called them Indian peoples or native peoples. But yeah, any of that, the original inhabitants of North America.
Supervisor Stark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I remember when I was in school learning about a subset, and maybe you can give me some clarity because my memory's faded since high school, you know. Woodland Indians, we learned about woodland Indians. Where do they fit in the context?
That's an earlier, one of the points, there's so many points I'd like to make. I spent a whole semester on sort of teaching American Indian history. That's an earlier sort of pre-contact group of people, because native peoples continue to change. And so the historic tribes that we know are sort of the people who were there when Europeans arrived, but they had emerged from earlier cultures like the woodlands, the Adena, the Hopewell, the Oneida, some of these other earlier forms, and peoples who had then become later. So the woodlands are, I think, the ancestors of the Menominee and the Ojibwa might well have been woodland Indians several hundred years or maybe 1,000 years earlier. Right, it's a larger cultural group when frankly we don't know as much about them because it's pre-contact and there aren't written records, so it's harder. We honestly, historians have to turn to archaeologists and anthropologists sometimes. We have to steal what they know to kind of understand those earlier cultures.
Supervisor Krause.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question about the Indian schools.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's under the State Department of Education or if they have their own teachers and their own system.
The Oneida School is run by the Oneida Nation, the Oneida tribe. I'm not sure in all other cases. There still is a Bureau of Indian Affairs Education Division that is running some schools. I don't know exactly which one's which in all cases. I know the Oneida School is controlled by the Oneida tribe, the Turtle School that I showed you. Some other ones still, I think, have BIA relationships today, but those schools are very different. Now, many of the teachers in Indian schools are, in fact, Indian peoples themselves. They, of course, are not engaged in the same sort of kind of purpose as those old boarding schools were of the late 19th and early 20th century. And are producing a curriculum that's much like what other people are getting, with a cultural enrichment piece that helps Native people sort of preserve their own identity that was in some ways disrupted, if not destroyed, by that period of the boarding school and allotment. And so there's a lot of an attempt to try to reestablish what was lost during that time period. A lot of Native people were so afraid of what their children would face in those boarding schools that they never taught their children their native language because they knew they'd be beaten for it if they went to the school and spoke it, particularly at some of the harsher ones. Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania is an example. To my knowledge, the one, particularly the Wittenberg one, the closer they are to the Indian peoples they're serving, the less often there's that kind of harsh physical treatment. Although understand the entire project, though, is to strip young people of their culture. And so that is probably true at all those schools, even those that physically treated the students in a better way, which not all of them did. But my sense is that like Wittenberg was not Carlisle, was not the worst of the worst in any way.
Supervisor Nutting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for this very beneficial presentation. It's very enlightening. Being in close proximity to our northern border, Canada, my assumption is that there were a number of Native groups that are in the Canadian area. I'm aware of a number of them myself, but could you enlighten us just for a few moments on that?
For one thing, the Ojibwa. So the Ojibwa are the most decentralized of the tribes that I spoke of tonight. Indeed, there the band is more important in some ways than the larger tribe. And so we have 6 bands that have reservations in Wisconsin, but there are many other bands who live in Minnesota, into the Dakotas, and through southern Canada in large numbers. Ojibwa is a very large and diffuse sort of people. Some of the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee in New York lived on both sides of the border. And one issue for some of them to this day is that they had for years, they didn't know there was going to be a border drawn between like New York and whatever is right above them in Canada. And starting in 1783, that border made a big difference. Once the United States became independent of Great Britain had its side, and Canada and the United States had its side, and free movement was no longer allowed. And to this very day, those people would like the ability to move back and forth without sort of regulation. And for a lot of reasons that are complicated, some are pretty good and some are pretty bad, neither the United States or Canada really wants that to happen. The idea of people moving without any passport across a border sort of disturbs them. Although to the Oneida, for instance, who live in New York, this seems the most natural of things because their ancestors talk about doing it for generations. But it's a different political world they live in now, right? And so that is one of the ways in which the Oneida would like to claim sovereignty, right? Because they, in some ways, see themselves as independent in a certain way of either the United States or the Canadian government. So that idea of being able to cross the border freely is a big issue for them. I'm not as aware of Ojibwa being as concerned about that, although if I lived in northern Minnesota, maybe I'd know more about that because I hear more about it, I'm going to guess. Although I don't know if there'd be anybody to stop them if they wanted to cross from parts of, western Minnesota up into Canada. I don't know I think it'd be pretty easy to sort of wander across and nobody would know you were doing it. So if you've ever been up that way, right? So.
Okay, Supervisor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want a little clarification. My understanding of the boarding schools is that was not like a traditional English boarding school where you decide to send your children
Correct.
there. It was compulsory, basically.
Correct.
The children were taken.
Yes, U.S.
And you
government
didn't see 'em
demanded
again.
that they go. There
Okay.
was actually no choice after 1903, 1891, and it became even stricter in 1903. Indian children had to go at the government's command, and in many cases were ripped away from their families, and in some cases their families were threatened with starvation if they refused to let go of their children. Some of them tried to hide their children and keep them from being taken, partly because not only the cultural thing that we talked about, the sort of cultural destruction, but some boarding schools were very dangerous places for young children to live because disease was rampant. There was an eye disease called trachoma, which could result in blindness, that was running rampant through many of these schools. And many children ripped away from their family underwent what I think we would understand as depression today. And some of them just simply sort of gave up, sick and died, committed suicide. There's some really tragic stories. Luther Standing Bear, who's a Native person who went to the boarding schools and then wrote about it later, said, behind every boarding school, there are so many little ones buried there that it breaks his heart. And so it was a devastating experience. And when they lost, one of the other really hard things is when they lost their identity, in many of these cultures, standing up and saying, my father is of a certain clan and my mother is of another clan, is the way in which you would say, my last name is Barker or my mother's maiden name was Lowe, right? I mean, it's a part of identity. And many Native people lost that. And so I know a Menominee elder who to this day tries to do genealogy for people who've lost their identity. And then those clans then bring that person back into the clan so they again have an identity in a way that I think anybody who's ever done genealogy, when you have a sense of who your ancestors were again, it gives you a sense of who you are and a sense of connection with the past that a lot of people find sort of life affirming. And I think that was also another thing that the boarding schools attempted to destroy. The attempt was really to destroy Native culture and to sort of acculturate these young children into the larger white society and assimilate them. And that was really the purpose of the boarding school, and it was mandatory. That's true.
Okay, any other questions? Well, Dr. Barker.
Yes.
I would like to thank you.
Thank you.
Especially for a great presentation and great enlightenment.
And one last thing, by the way, if you want to know more, I think this is a really good book, The Indian Nations of Wisconsin by Patty Lowe. You may know her from Wisconsin Public Television. She's an enrolled member of the Bad River Ojibwa Band, and she worked with the Indian nations that I talked about tonight on their own histories, and it's a collection, gives you a lot of amazing stories that I didn't have time for today. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, I think this is one of the most readable and accessible books that you might want to be interested in. I know Yankees always has it, and other places do, I'm sure too, Amazon, whatever. So that's another place you might go for further resources.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will move on. Item number 8C has been pulled and will be presented on Tuesday. And we'll move on to 8D. We have progress report on the jail structural repairs. We have the Facilities Capital Management Director, Michael Lauder, along with Joe Schukart from Findorf. So they will be providing us with an update.
Good evening. Last time I was here, we didn't know a whole lot. We just came here asking for some money to fix the jail. Told you that we didn't have a lot of information. We're coming to you with a solution based on the knowledge that we had at the time. So tonight, we want to kind of bring you up to speed on what we do know, where we're at, and what has changed. First of all, after we were done with the shoring and we were able to start the project, the engineer asked us to do some testing where we drill cores into the concrete and then have those cores tested. And we did 12 cores, and of the 12, 4 came back lower than what was spec'd originally in the project. So that required the engineer to recalculate his solution and come up with another solution, which we moved forward with. And after we did that, then we started opening up some ceilings and started instituting the solution. They started measuring some of the column capitals, and they were smaller than what the drawings had shown. So we were required then to go back and do some more design work and some more calculating. And we have come up with a solution where they're going to drill through the column capitals. They're going to add bolts. They're going to epoxy around those bolts. But what that required for us is we originally had 20 column capitals repair. We now have 45 column capitals to repair. Some of the other things that were added were he now wants us to do a metal collar around all of the columns and then kick braces back up to the capital. They've been working diligently with Findorf's engineers and another engineer actually from Michigan that Mike, the engineer that we hired, worked with in the past, and they believe they have a really good solution. Unfortunately, that solution and the added columns added to the cost. So we are now at a number, we originally brought you $1,374,611. We are now at a project that's got a value of $1,941,733. So that's a real quick synopsis of
what happened over the last month and what we've been doing, and we would be happy to answer any questions. Joe has been on site working on the project. He knows a lot more about the everyday stuff that's going on, and would welcome any questions.
Any questions by the board? You'll see later on in the agenda, we are addressing the additional funding requirements that's going to be needed for that project in the bonding issue. So go ahead, Supervisor Wagner.
Thank you, Chair. I guess I wish I would have asked sooner that you brought some pictures of the damage. I didn't really realize driving by the courthouse how bad it was when you were talking about it. I watched the news tonight, and the news media shows cracks and things and stuff that, to me, the visual picture of how bad it would be, and then coming tonight with, this is what we thought we were going to do, and have a picture of it, to have even a short video and say, but this is considerably smaller than what was spec'd, and that is why we have to do this now. Maybe it's an age thing for me, but a walking tour or something with an explanation would validate a $600,000 or $700,000 change in what I agreed to before. So in the future, I'd hope that we, when we're going to adjust and make changes to things that are physical, that we'd be able to see the damage and understand it better. Thanks.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
No, so I mean, just a quick note. Part of what we have to do is, and some of it you can't see, meaning when we're looking at it, and if you guys are familiar with a column capital, a column is round, obviously the capital is the bottom part of the slab portion. And
I guess I object to you assuming I know those things.
that's why
That's my point is, I am not an engineer, even though one of my children is.
And so what we are ended up to do, though, is we literally are x-raying every area around those columns. So the point is that some of it's not a visual thing. We're actually having to x-ray, and then we're actually taking those drawings, and we go with the engineer, and we literally have to pick the points where we can drill, because clearly we already have issues. We cannot be compromising more rebar in that structural slab. And so it's a painstaking process, and so unfortunately it's not very visual though. Probably not what you want to hear, but I mean it's just not very visual.
The initial, I mean, it was very visual, the cracks that were in there that I saw on TV tonight. So I was amazed at the size of the cracks. If I would have saw one of your hands in a picture sticking inside a crack and say, this is a problem, it would have been very physical to me to understand any changes that you might have later. So it's just a comment, nothing negative or positive, no, cool.
Supervisor Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any liability going back to twice, Michael, you mentioned that it did not meet the specs of the original construction? And it's been 20 years. Is there a liability to go back after the contractor?
I will defer to Corp Counsel because it's been discussed amongst leadership. It's been discussed amongst the administration, but I will let the.
And the answer is we'll see. But that is definitely something that we're trying to keep track of. We're trying to determine exactly what those flaws were. And we're also trying to track our time and money that's being used to repair that. So we have a couple of different approaches that we've talked about, and I'd be happy to speak with you more privately about that.
Supervisor Combs.
I'd like to back with Supervisor Wagner said, we should have walked us right over there that night. I did walk after the meeting to go look what was going on, and I really would have helped everyone to have a little bit of idea. The core samples, that's basically the core of the cement is not a good enough cement, or you're also tracking the rebar, or what's the deal there? I'm not an engineer neither.
Yeah, so what we do is we take a core sample of the concrete, which is just it's a machine that you mount to the concrete slab, and it drills in and takes a cylinder out of the concrete, and then we take that, and there's a couple different tests. One is just a compression test to see how much pressure you can place on it and what it breaks at. The second part is how it breaks. And then the third part is what's called a petrographic study of that sample. And so all three of those were done. There were differing results on those. And, there's some elements that, so the numbers that came back, what was reported in the original construction is that they were at strength, and that they're now not. What we found now is that they're not at strength. So there can be things that go on with the concrete, and, that I'm not a petrographer, so I can't state what it is, but so that's something we're continuing to study, is what's going on with that concrete and why it didn't break at the same strength as what was replaced.
And the other thing that they do is they take samples around the building, so they're just periodic. So the fact that we had some that failed, you have to assume all of them are gonna be at the lowest level that they failed at. So that what required him to re-engineer everything now and say, this is our overall starting point again.
Okay, Supervisor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Supervisor Schaefer addressed half my concerns there about the initial builder. And did I hear you say that some of the columns were not as large as they were supposed to be? Some of the floors were not as thick as they were supposed to be? Is that correct?
Column capitals were not, some of them were not the size they were supposed to be. And I think we've had reports where some of the floor thickness was off a little bit from tests that we've taken where there's been some sagging.
Right. So it's not just the quality of the concrete, it's the fact that they didn't do it to spec. Is that correct?
Could be, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions by the board? All right. Thank you. And moving on to item number 9, review and discussion on Tuesday meeting agenda items. Number 9A1, we will have a memorial and life and public service of Karen Kelbach, and that will be on Tuesday. And we'll move on to item B, appointments. Number 9B1, Administrator Recruitment Task Force.
Appointing Mary Ellen Schill, attorney with Reuter Ware, to serve on the Marathon County Administrator Recruitment Task Force.
Any questions on that appointment? Okay, item 9B2, Board of Health.
Appointing Tiffany Lee, 1814 Milwaukee Avenue, Wausau, to the Board of Health to complete a term ending December 31st, 2021, replacing Julie Fox.
Any questions on that appointment? Okay, moving on to item 9B3, North Central Community Services Program Board.
Appointing Eric Anderson, 6609 Magnolia Avenue, Wausau, for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2022.
Any questions on that appointment? Supervisor Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like the idea of putting the bio of the Dr. Anderson in there, which is first time I think we've ever seen that on any appointment. And I think that's something we should maybe look at doing in the future so that we know a little bit about the background of these appointments.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, item 9B4, ADRC CW Advisory Board.
Appointing Tony Omernick, 155560 Reslon Road, Wausau, to the Aging and Disability Resource Center Board of Central Wisconsin Advisory Committee, replacing Pam Frary to complete her 3-year term expiring December 31st, 2020.
Supervisor Krause.
Yes, I wanted to go back to the Board of Health appointment. And when Joan Thurer had talked to our group, I asked her about putting some alternative licensed people on the board, and she said that they were looking for people who have degrees in public health. And I was wondering what kind of background the person who was appointed to the Board of Health, what kind of background they have.
I would defer to the administrator.
A lot of the people have degrees in public health. When I made this next appointment, was looking for a regular person, a person with a young family who was also interested in parent-child health and stuff like that. So I didn't pick somebody with a Master's of Public Health. I feel like the committee's got a number of people that represent that now. She also works at the, I think where she works. She works at the Wausau River District downtown.
Okay, we're down to 9B4, the ADR CCW Advisory Board. Any further questions on that appointment? Okay, on item 9B5, Social Services Board.
Appointing County Supervisor Lauren White and County Supervisor Romy Wagner to the Social Services Board to complete terms that expire at the Organizational County Board meeting in April 2020.
Supervisor White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a correction, it's Krieger Avenue. Addresses are important.
Okay, any other questions on those appointments? Item 9B6, Local Emergency Planning Committee.
Appointing Lieutenant Nathan Pauls of the Wausau Police Department to the Local Emergency Planning Committee for an indefinite term, replacing Andrew Hartwig.
Any questions on that appointment? Okay, moving on to ordinances. Under item C, ordinances. 1, Environmental Resources Committee. Item 9C, 1A, Town of Rib Falls rezone, Gary Krieger for Roger Ross and Verlin Ross. Ordinance 21-19. Any questions on that? Okay, item 9C, 1B, Town of Elderon rezone, Tammy Miller, Kadrusky, ordinance 22-19. Okay, from the Public Service Committee, item 9C, 2A, amending section 12.01 and 12.03 of the General Code of Ordinances regulating alarm systems to increase fees and simplify penalties. Ordinance 23-19. Supervisor Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When was the original fee $25, and how long has that been in effect?
Supervisor McEwen, Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, if the board doesn't object, Captain Jason Plaza from the Sheriff's Department is here, and he could probably answer those questions, but I believe it's been over 25 years since it's been increased. And just for a little follow-up information, this did come to public safety in April. We did look at the fee structure and realized that there was some neglect as far as getting permits out to people and the fee structure. So it was authorized, or it was approved by public safety back in April, but we need the board to approve it. So thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. The nearest we can discover that it's been about 25 years since this ordinance was placed on the books.
Okay, any other questions? Supervisor Guild.
So I've actually had outreach from a couple of my constituents with concerns about the increase, the expansion, and I was hoping that you could maybe provide some additional context about what is this money going to be utilized for? Why is it, as was spoken during public comment, why is it that we need this funding and this increase in funding? How does money for these permits go to support what this is supposed to be doing? Because I've had both businesses and residents reach out concerned about why they have to pay this when they're already paying for their services, they're paying for their systems, all of those different sides.
The additional revenue will go directly back into our communications division to help offset some additional 911 dispatchers, along with maintaining the database. When this was created 25 years ago, it was actually earlier this year when I looked at the ordinance, I learned that only the businesses and homeowners out in the townships were being charged this $25 and $50 fee. And as we progressed along throughout the spring and summer, we learned that the city of Wausau, Rothschild, and all of the other villages and cities in Marathon County were not being charged for their alarm systems. So we felt that it was very unfair for us to be charging the businesses out in the county, but not in the city and villages. So the additional revenue would be to offset additional 911 dispatchers who deal directly with the alarms that come in from the alarm companies, like this fine gentleman from Weston. Did everything right, got his alarm, paid his permit. Permar, most of the time, vets these calls, but there's a lot of people out there that don't keep their information up to date. Officers are out at the scene asking our dispatchers to please try and find a current phone number. We're checking land records. So it's granted, it's law enforcement's jurisdiction in Everest Metro, but we as first responders in the 911 dispatch center also have that call hanging on when we have other calls pending too. So this way, when we get an updated permit fee, every year they are asked to submit all the contact information, and we can now put that into our new computer-aided dispatch system that we have. So that information can be accessed by the law enforcement officer and our dispatcher in just a few seconds. There's time and again with these alarm companies that they don't have a current contact number for the homeowners or business owners, or they can't get a hold of them. And we would like to have that information on our fingertips.
Thank you, that helps. One additional follow-up, just with the amount of the fee, going straight from basically doubling it. Was there any discussion about doing some kind of a graduated system so that the hit wasn't as much, or that there's any kind of future acceleration, or what? How did you land on let's just double the fee?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think since its inception, with it being $25.50, very nominal, I think there was a discussion where we should, what we knew we had to do was bring a bunch of new people on board because they were never paying for the alarm permit. And what we didn't want to do was bring them on this year under the 25 and 50, and then next year add jump the money up to 50 and 100. That's what we didn't want to do. So we thought it was a good time to raise the rates from 25 to 50, 50 to 100 all at once and be done with it. And then we can leave it alone for another 25 years.
Okay, Supervisor Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't hear about this until Monday when it was actually on the news. Is it true that a new employee found that these ordinances weren't being followed correctly?
Well, we had a new staff in our administrative division. She's tasked with sending out the invoices, and she began asking questions, and I began asking questions, and then the more we looked into it, I learned that a large number of these business owners and homeowners in the villages and cities were not being charged this permit fee.
How could that happen, that they weren't being charged? I mean, that this was being missed for like 20, 25 years. I mean, how do you think that happened? I mean,
I have no idea. There was obviously an oversight on someone's part in our division. So, and you know, over the years, it just got missed.
does that person still work for? Does that person still work for?
There's probably 4 or 5 different people in that position over the years. So no, and that person does not work here.
Okay, thank you.
I think a lot has to do with, we were under the assumption that all alarms within Marathon County should have a permit. We were under the assumption that, like the city of Wausau, Village of Rothschild had their own ordinances on it, and they were charging their citizens that. And when we learned that they didn't have such a ordinance, that would enable us to have our ordinance come into effect. Correct, Scott?
That is correct. We're prohibited from double charging people. So if another municipality has such a permit ordinance, we're not allowed to charge them again. And I don't know what happened 25 years ago, but I think there was a move among several different law enforcement agencies to start doing this. And it may have been assumed that other municipalities were going to be passing their own permit ordinances, but apparently they didn't, so.
The other thing, 25 years ago, you got to understand, the city of Wausau had their own dispatch, and then dispatch was eventually merged into the county to dispatch for all emergency services in the county. So that's another contributing factor. Supervisor Wagner.
Do we have any idea how much additional revenue this is going to generate?
We're hoping between $60,000 and $70,000.
Will that in any way impact the new channel for 911 that was discussed in budget year last year? Will it go towards that maybe?
It'll go towards the additional dispatcher that is going to be added, correct?
Thank you.
Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add a few more things, I did speak to the chief in Rothschild, Jeremy Hunt, and the chief in Everest Metro, Clay Schultz, about this, just to make sure that they weren't going to be, as Corp Counsel said, double dipping by sending out permit fees too. And to kind of follow up, they hadn't been doing that in a long time. And I think what happened is when the dispatch went from Weston, and I know Lauren White was around at that time. Weston had their own dispatch also. So I think as things progressed and it went to one central dispatch, those things kind of fell by the side. And one of the individuals that called me is in Weston, and he told me he hasn't been paying a permit fee for a long time. He said he didn't get a bill, so he wasn't going to pay it. So which I didn't blame him, but I did, reinforce the fact that I did talk to the chief in both of those communities, which are in my district, and they highly support the sheriff's department taking this over totally, so that it's uniformed, and there'll be an annual date when these permits are due. And like I said, they support it. Just for the fact that they really want that other channel up and running also, so and they know that this is going to help to improve, to get that channel going. Thank you.
Supervisor Gomes.
Mr. Chairman, we used to have a Parmar security at our town shop about 30 years ago. And then we equipped the neighbor, the closest guy that lived there, with a shotgun, and he was the guy that did the enforcing. But what we found out, it was a bead of light that would get broken, and that's how the alarm would go off. And finally, we just set out a mousetrap, and that took care of that. My question for you, sir, is as we discuss this $25 increase in fee, how much do these people pay a year to have the alarm system? That's what I want to know.
Sir?
Supervisor White.
There, I mean,
Yeah.
there,
I think it varies depending on the service that they have, whether, and depending whether it's PERMA or whether there's other security services out there. Okay, Supervisor White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking as Officer White, and I'm going to throw you in the battle too, Officer McEwen. He and I, in our career, went on many of these calls. Nobody maintained, or excuse me, you get to a call, what's the phone number? You could tell the dispatch was looking through something. Oh no, he hasn't worked here for 10 years. He hasn't worked here for 5 years. And when you're an officer, there's enough stress on you. You would like to have somebody there as soon as possible so you can enter a building safely. And if there's someone in there that wants to shoot you, that you're going to get in there without having a problem. I happened to be involved in our dispatch for many years, before it was Everest Metro PD. But it was also used by other services. Fire service used them because they wanted somebody, if there was a fire reported in a building, it's not just law enforcement, it's all emergency services. And I realize that it's expensive, but if you're expecting somebody to respond to your home, save your life, save your property, I'm pretty sure $50 a year is, although for some it could be a lot, is minimal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, any other questions? And like I said, the one thing that I will point out is one of the things that's actually is imperative about the new licensing fee is the requirement to update the key holders of all of the businesses, contact individuals, so that dispatch has those critical information and law enforcement and can provide that information on an updated annual basis, where in some cases that information has long been not updated. So any other questions on that item? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Supervisor Johnson.
Get the hint? Operator error. This one works. Mr. Chair, you brought up the point of that it has to be updated. That's great. Who's responsible for the updating? Is that the company that they contract with, or is that the individual or the individual business?
The individual owning the property, and because they have tried to work, in some cases, they have tried to work with these security systems, and the security systems companies have said they are contracted with the property owner and not to provide, and are not going to provide that information. And so it's incumbent upon the property owner to be able to, and the county to be, dispatch to be able to receive that information on an updated basis annually, so that that database is maintained correctly.
Really? So it seems to me we're charging the wrong person. We should be charging the person that's providing the service. I mean, if they want to hook into the system, they want to use that as a selling point for their service, I think they should pay for it, not the individual. Thank you.
Difficult for Marathon County to contract with the service to. Okay, moving on, 9C 2B, amending section, and thank you, amending section 5.01 and 5.05 of the General Code of Ordinances regarding ending the role and responsibility of the Marathon County Civil Service Commission with respect to hiring of deputy sheriffs and confirming authority to hiring solely on the sheriff's office. Ordinance 24-19. Supervisor Miller.
I have a question regarding how the sheriff's department is going to do that. Who in the sheriff's department? Are they going to have certain individuals, or set up a committee within the sheriff's department?
we have the sheriff here, and I know he wasn't maybe prepared for this. The question in regarding the ending of the civil service involvement in the hiring process.
What was the question again? Sorry, I was outside talking to people about the alarms. Sorry about that.
The question Supervisor Miller posed was who in the sheriff's office is then responsible for the hiring if the Civil Service Commission is taken out of the hiring process of deputies.
So it would become a process of where we're going to do assessments. So in this day and age, the role of the Civil Service Commission has changed vastly. We are one of only, I believe, 2 counties in the state of Wisconsin that still had a Civil Service Commission that they utilized on a regular basis. Most of them have phased it out a long time ago because it slows the hiring process down. In this particular case, we were losing great candidates to other municipal agencies who could move faster through the process because they didn't have to follow the same rules and regulations of the commission. Some of those candidates were employees that we had sent through the Court Security Division over here because of the individuals that we have out here and the quality of training that we provide. They're very viable candidates for our local municipalities. So by moving forward on this and having them not be part of the new hire process, it'll allow us to change up how we do things. We'll be able to do most of it in one day or possibly 2 days, because in this day and age, if you don't identify a candidate and let that candidate know that you're interested in that candidate and want to pursue that candidate, within a couple days, that candidate is moving on to another law enforcement agency that's moving quicker than you are. There aren't enough law enforcement candidates that are viable and wanted around the state of Wisconsin to fill all the openings that are present. So we needed to make this change.
Follow up?
So, Sheriff, who specifically, how is it going to be done within your department?
So we have field training officers who go out and train our new hires. They travel with them for 16 weeks during 3 different phases. They'll be part of the hiring process. They'll be doing some of the assessments that will be done, and those will be like scene scenario assessments, so we can observe these individuals going through various scenes, like say a traffic stop, high-risk stop, see how they perform. We'll have management be part of the interview process, where they'll be asking key questions in regards to law enforcement tactics. We'll also have core value questions that are asked in relation to either management or our lieutenants, and then we'll be looking at our tactical officers to assess firearms capabilities.
Thank you. I understand completely that how important this is. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Supervisor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Don't walk away yet, Scott.
Oh, I was going to say, I was just going to step back in case that.
No, I just want to follow up a little bit because I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. Sure. Is that you said you want to be able to move within a day or 2? Now, that's after evaluation, correct? After this is not.
It's after all testing.
It's after all the testing, because you're not going to get all that done in a day or 2. Actually, where somebody applies and it's like, oh, a day later, this is our guy, or is that the case?
So right now, we're looking at different models that are used around the state of Wisconsin. One of them in particular is Appleton, and we looked at Racine and some of these other cities that are moving a lot faster than we are, and they can do a lot of these assessments within 2 days. Then after that, you start to do more background investigation. So at least you're letting the candidate know that he's finished high enough on your list that he's going to possibly be hired if he can pass the background, the physical, the mental, and all the other tests that are going to be done.
And how long does the current process take using the Civil Service
Sometimes
Commission?
the current process takes several months. By the time we arrange the written test, arrange for interviews with Civil Service Commission where they can come in and all be together to conduct the interviews, and then get it over to us for assessment, because management still does an assessment on individuals. It takes a period of time, and it's not against the Civil Service Commission. They try to move as fast as they possibly can, but you're dealing with a group that slows the process down where we can keep it going forward.
Okay, and one last question. This one would be probably best addressed to the chair for an opinion. Well, liability, is there any change in liability to the county by switching from a Civil Service Commission to having the sheriff be the hiring or appointing authority?
I really don't believe so. Again, I think they are an organization of Marathon County, and they've been created by our ordinances, and you see when you look at it, it really is a modification of our own ordinances and our own procedure, so.
So no change in liability?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And ultimately, when it was discussed at HR, we asked the ultimate question, was there value that was being added by having the Civil Service Commission involved? And the answer came back that it wasn't. It was slowing the process down and effectively costing us good candidates. Supervisor Rosenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't actually have a question, but I did want to say that I talked to at least 2 people on the Civil Service Commission right now, and they are very supportive of this change. So if you have any concerns there.
I could touch on that. And I was going to bring that up too. Thank you, Supervisor Rosenberg. So the Civil Service Commission had been talked to by us prior to, and a majority of them were interested in having this move forward as is, with the opportunity for them to continue being part of the promotional process. The promotional process can move slower than what the hiring process is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right, we will move on to number 3, Human Resources, Finance, and Property, item 9C, 3A, amending section 2.01, parent 19, General Code of Ordinances to remove provision for automatic resolution for 3% increase for supervisor and board chair salaries, and add a provision that if no action is taken, increase will be 0. Ordinance 0-25-19. Supervisor Opal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'd like to ask the reasoning and all the thought process that went into this, and I guess no matter what the answer, I have a follow-up comment.
Sure. The discussion at HR and Finance, 2 things. One, there's always been a little bit of a challenge, if you will, when you had something that automatically happened and there was no actual direct action taken to increase something without being, even though this board votes on those rules back in April at the organizational meeting, it was felt that by doing nothing, the setting next term's salaries automatically increased if no action was being taken, felt icky. That's not an official term, but, and so it was discussed, and it was felt that the board should remove that rule of an automatic increase without doing any action, and that it be discussed every term by HR Finance whether or not there's going to be an increase, and set those salaries based on the discussion that actually takes place by HR Finance prior to the new board taking out papers for that term.
Well, I can see this probably going to end up being a no increase for a long time, because if we go for even 2%, you're going to see in the newspaper, oh my God, they're asking for a raise. You know, I don't know if it was, you know, and I hate to get after any kind of committee, but I don't know if that was taken into consideration or not. But I can see this having, not that I'm a money grubber, and you know, I'm independently wealthy, very independently, but I just can see the bad rap we will get in any kind of publication looking for any kind of raise. With that, I surrender my time.
Okay, Supervisor Stark.
Thank you. As the chair of finance, when we threw this issue, it was on the agenda, and there was some pretty good discussion surrounding it, and it came at the same time as magically we were talking about the budget. And we were looking at the impact to the employees of the county and the fact that their rates of insurance costs were dramatically increasing, which was going to take a bigger bite out of their salary because if it's approved as it's going to be presented, they're going to end up having to fund more of their healthcare costs than they did before. And so we looked at it, and in the scheme of things, we're part of this organization, and why should we automatically get a raise without any consideration? It started out more on there should be nothing automatic about a raise. We should take into consideration, is there inflation? Is there, all of the things you consider before, you make give somebody a raise or give a department a raise. And we just thought automatic is not the answer. And then the worst part about the automatic was we've been doing 2%. If we just say, well, I don't know, I just throw caution to wind. If we do nothing, then it's 3%. How would that fly? That's even, more dramatically unfair. So after a considerable amount of discussion, we decided, you know what? If we do nothing, it's 0. If we want to vote up an increase, we can vote an increase. But we didn't like the idea of automatically having 3% if we decided to do nothing.
Supervisor Boots?
So I voted against this the first time we were asking for a raise. And exactly what happened, I thought it was going to happen, happened. Marathon County Board votes themselves a raise, $10 a month. I don't understand why we would even give ourselves a raise to listen to the public say, oh my God, I can't believe you gave yourself a raise. It's $10 a month. Are we really that hard up?
Supervisor Miller?
Well, I think Supervisor Stark probably said as well what I'm thinking. But the administrator at our finance meeting said, it just does not sit well with the rank and file. We're sitting there giving ourselves automatic, and the people who are really doing the work for the county, people that are up in the pits, they don't get that. And it just doesn't look good to them. It probably doesn't look good to the public. So I say, yes, I agree with this. Let's take it on each budget. If we think we deserve it, we'll give it. If we don't, we won't. So be it.
Understand that you have to set the, just a point of clarification, is we can't take it on in every budget. It is only can be taken out and discussed by the board prior to the next board being taking out or able to take out nomination papers, which starts December 1st of 2019 for the 2020 to 2022 term. And so that's the only time that an increase or an adjustment to those salaries can be scheduled. Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Supervisor Stark and Supervisor Boots kind of mentioned some of the things I was going to mention. I know I think it was at Finance, it was mentioned that most of the employees are going to be lucky if they get a 2% raise. And it would look kind of disingenuous to the employees if we're automatically giving ourselves a 3% raise. I know it's only $10 or $12 or whatever. It's just the point of the percentage. So that was the reason I think this is a good idea that we amend the code and make sure that if we are going to talk about a raise, that we do it legitimately. Thank you.
Supervisor Krause.
Thank you, Board Chair. I would like to say that I don't see anything wrong with giving ourselves a little bit of a raise. If it was like 10% or 15%, I would say, hey, that's who gets that? I mean, a lot of people are getting raises today. And I was on a tour with the county Recreation, Forests, and Parks Department last week, and they're getting more grants, and they're getting a raise. They're allowing themselves a raise. I'm on retirement, and for years, Social Security Administration did not give or increase any of the retirement monies. It's called the COLA, or cost of living allowance. So with inflation, we weren't getting any money, but the costs were going up. and it's a really tough thing. And now sometimes they're giving us like 1% or 2%. But there's a lot of seniors here, and we know that it's hard to budget on a fixed income. Seniors, the elderly, are really put in a hard spot. So I don't see as 3% as so terrible. And a lot of other people are getting raises. Why shouldn't we? Thank you.
Supervisor Rosenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this resolution. I also voted against the raises last time when they came around. And I think that if we want to give ourselves raises, we should do what everyone else around here does and review ourselves. So I would like it if we could review ourselves as a board. I think that would be great. If we can make the case that we deserve that increase, let's go for it.
I think the review is done, called the election box. Supervisor Nutting.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Historically, there was a very good reason why this was put into effect, and we would have to divert back to history as to, I don't know if Mr. Carter, if you have with your years as to when it took place, but it was put into action to avoid the very thing that is coming before us right now, and to encourage people to potentially run for the office. So I think it should be something that we should hear as to why it was.
You want me to speak to it? I don't have specific recall what year it was, but I do seem to recall that Supervisor Ken Day was one of the proponents of it. And I remember that there was considerable discussion, even after it was passed by the board, whether if somebody challenged that would really be a legal increase, and that you may end up in a situation where you have to backtrack.
Okay, Supervisor White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When this came up and I read through the agenda, I actually wrote up a speech, but we're not going to do that. So, like all of us here, I think all of us here ran for local office, not in the expectation that we were going to make big bucks at this. Because if we were, I'd find something else to do that I'd get paid a heck of a lot more.
Please use the mic a little closer so I.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I thought I spoke. Well, at any rate, I am not in favor of anything in particular that's automatic. In my years as a supervisor in the PD, our officers, and we had to justify why they got raises. In my previous career in local election, 15 years without a pay increase, I didn't care. I also am on Social Security. But actually, I'm doing pretty good. Thanks to all of you who are still working. Keep it up. Thank you. So just a comment and observation. I'm glad to see that it's being eliminated as an automatic, or the proposal. Thank you.
Okay, any other discussion on that agenda item? Any other discussion? Okay, moving on to 9C, 3B, repealing and recreating Section 5.20, General Code of Ordinances addressing the collection of fees by the Marathon County District Attorney's Office, Ordinance 26-19. Any discussion? Okay, moving on, resolutions. Item 9D1A, approval of the Town of Mosinee Local Zoning Ordinance Amendment, Resolution 54-19. Any discussion on that resolution? Okay, item number 9D1B, approval of the Town of Mosinee Local Zoning Ordinance Amendment, Resolution 55-19. Seeing none, we'll move on to Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee. Item 9D2A, initial resolution authorized not to exceed $2,700,000 general obligation bonds or promissory notes for Marathon County Jail emergency repairs. Resolution 56-19. This will require 3/4 majority of the board. Any discussion? Corp Counsel would like to address the board.
And I just wanted a word on this series of resolutions. These resolutions were provided to us by bond counsel and prepared under contract that we have with them. So when we get to the voting meeting on Thursday, on Tuesday, today's Thursday. When we get to the voting meeting on Tuesday, we would, if you start proposing amendments to these resolutions at that time, that's going to be very destructive to our ability to go ahead, because we won't have time to address that with our bond counsel. So if anybody has changes that they want to make, and I hope there aren't any, but if you do, I'm asking you to contact me or Christie right away so that we can pose that question to bond counsel, because I don't want to see that happening on Tuesday.
Supervisor Gomes.
Mr. Chairman, how does that work with vacant seats? Is that a no vote too?
It is. That has been asked of me on a couple of occasions here, and that does not constitute a no vote under these circumstances. It does not, because the statute that talks about the 3/4 vote indicates that 3/4 of the members elect. And if you look at the definition of members elect under Chapter 59, it indicates people who are members of the board whose term has not been ended by resignation or death. And so we have two of those situations, but those seats are not held by members elect at this time. So they would not constitute the number, the denominator on the number.
Any other questions? Okay, item 9D, 2B, resolution declaring the official intent to reimburse expenditures for the Marathon County Emergency Jail repairs, Resolution 57-19. Any questions on that resolution? Okay, number 9D, 2C, resolution providing for the sale of not to exceed $9,590,000 general obligation corporate purpose notes, Series 2019A, Resolution 58-19. Okay. From the Extension, Education and Economic Development Committee, item 9D, 3A, proclaming October 23rd, 2019 as Early Childhood Development Awareness Day in Marathon County, Resolution 59-19. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none. Announcements and/or requests. Supervisor Rosenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to share on October 3rd, as I was trying to get out the door to work, and I heard sirens wailing from every direction. I live on Emerson Street, and that's on the southeast side of Wausau. And 1 block away from me is the Pine Grove Cemetery on Grand Avenue. Squads from emergency responders and squads from Wausau, Everest Metro, and the Marathon County Sheriff's Department were flying to the scene of what we later learned was a deadly shooting. It was a devastating day for my neighborhood and my city and my county. I was really deeply saddened to learn that the person who was targeted and killed was somebody who took joyful responsibility for the people's history of Marathon County. Wow, I didn't realize I was gonna feel so emotional. Patty Grimm, who worked at Pine Grove, was by all accounts a cemetery historian. She held a wealth of information that she gathered not because she was forced to or because it was part of her job. She was curious and wanted to help our community better understand our ancestors, personal and collective. She was very well known by the Marathon County Historical Society and by anyone who frequently visited the cemetery like me. 2 weeks ago, Marathon County lost an amazing and dedicated woman, so I just wanted to say thanks to the emergency responders who quickly arrived on the scene and arrested the suspect, and to Patty's family, we're just so sorry for your loss.
Supervisor Guild.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to briefly touch on the item that is actually mentioned in our proclamation and invite my fellow County Board Supervisors to take advantage of the email shared by Supervisor Robinson and attend the No Small Matter documentary viewing next week, Wednesday, the 23rd. And it is about so much more than just babysitting a bunch of kids. It does have an impact. The information that we're going to learn does have an impact on Marathon County's economy, our workforce, our community for a really long time, and it's a great way to learn more about that. If you can't attend, but you're interested in learning more, let me know. We actually have had an offer from the people putting it on that they would be happy to set up a showing for the county board members who are interested. So I'd like to know if there is interest in that. So please do reach out to me. I am a part of that planning committee if you would like to learn more. Thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just would like to remind everybody and invite everyone, the Rules and Review Committee is meeting again the 22nd in the Employee Resource Room at 5 o'clock. So if you have any comments or would like to have the Rules Review Committee look at any changes, please attend that meeting. Thank you.
Okay, any other announcements or requests? One announcement, just a note to everyone on the board. The Tuesday, October 22nd, 2019 business meeting starts at 7:30. Again, this was a compromise to assist the City of Wausau Council people. We have Supervisor Krause.
Yes, if I may, I'd like to read the State of Wisconsin Office of the Governor proclamation. It is a little late, but it was proclaimed September 23rd to 27th as National Clean Energy Week, and I passed out a paper, so if you'd like, you could read along with me. Whereas Executive Order 38 established a goal of transitioning our great state to 100% clean energy assumption by 2050 to be achieved primarily through the utilization of solar, wind, hydro, biomass, and biogas sources, as well as by developing support from technologies such as energy storage. And whereas the state of Wisconsin has committed to fulfilling the carbon reduction goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, which extends beyond electricity sector carbon emissions to include all forms of carbon emissions from Wisconsin. And whereas the transportation sector consumes 23.6% of Wisconsin's total energy use, while petroleum costs Wisconsin taxpayers $8.4 billion per year, when instead Wisconsin could utilize energy from clean electricity and clean fuels produced in Wisconsin. And whereas the price of solar and wind energy has dropped over 80% and nearly 70% over the past decade, respectively, and are now less expensive than coal-generated electricity, which costs taxpayers nearly $900 million per year. And whereas the clean energy sector currently supports over 76,000 jobs in Wisconsin, and positions like solar installer and wind turbine technician lead the way as the two fastest growing jobs in America. And whereas due to their on-site nature, many clean energy jobs are inherently local, cannot be outsourced, and are critical to the growth of local economies. And whereas National Clean Energy Week encourages increased organizational and individual support of innovative solutions that address America's economic and energy needs, and presents an opportunity for municipalities and individuals to implement the cleanest, lowest emitting energy technology available. So this was signed by Governor Tony Evers, and I would also like to mention that as we went from horses to automobiles, and we went from candles and torches to electricity, and we went from typewriters and stenographers to computers. We will be transitioning from coal and nuclear and other kinds of energies into alternative energy. That is the big push for the future, and our young people already know about it and are concerned about it. Thank you.
Okay, any other announcements? Seeing none, I'll take the famous motion. Supervisor Langenhau with the motion and Supervisor Opel with the second to adjourn. Any discussion? All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.